Hi everyone, how are you doing? Good? Good. I want to start by acknowledging that we're on unceded Coast Salish territory, lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people, and offer my thanks and my gratitude to those nations and those peoples for stewarding this land, for having us on your land. And I want to say that I walk here in this space today with good intentions and walk lightly here in this space. And to particularly offer that gratitude and respect and acknowledgement, because as I think is hopefully abundantly clear in the context of this event, that there's no way that we can talk about Burnaby Mountain without talking about what it means for Indigenous land defense and what it means more fundamentally for Indigenous sovereignty. And that Burnaby Mountain, this is the 1 year anniversary of Burnaby Mountain, but really that the struggle for the mountain and the struggle for the land and the struggle to honor land and honor the ancestors whose land this is really goes back not 1 year, but decades and centuries. And so to ground ourselves in that context. And in terms of one of the main lessons of Burnaby Mountain, I think that is probably the main one. I think the main lesson of Burnaby Mountain is how do we do work as people who care about land, as people who care about our neighborhoods, as people who care about the living ecosystems that we're part of. How do we do this work while acknowledging that this work needs to be rooted in Indigenous sovereignty, and that aligning with Indigenous peoples cannot just be something that we do when we happen to care about the environment because we realize that we can find common alliance. It's something that we need to do as people, as an ethical responsibility, as a moral responsibility. No? Yes. And as something that is not just, and not to say that this is what Burnaby Mountain was in any way, but I'm drawing, I think, broader lessons for those of us who are involved in environmental defense work, in land defense work, is how do we build relationships with Indigenous communities that aren't necessarily about, sometimes opportunistic alliance, right? Where we realize that we're finding common cause, but that isn't grounded in the entirety of what Indigenous nationhood means, which means defense of the land and also means defense of women, defense of life, affirmation of culture, of language, all of the different aspects of nationhood. Sorry, my kid's distracting me. And all of those things. So that we are affirming Indigenous nationhood in all of its aspects, all of the time, not simply when we're talking about defending a mountain that is on Tsleil-Waututh land, because that mountain is on Tsleil-Waututh land and on Squamish and shared Musqueam lands. So that means that in order for us to do this work, we need to be in alliance with the people of Tsleil-Waututh all of the time. Not just when we're on the mountain, but all the time, every single day, to understand protocol, to understand history, to understand language, to understand nationhood constantly. And so I think for all of us who are involved in the mountain in any way, for all of us involved in this work, I think that's probably our biggest lesson. And definitely, as Caleb was saying, the mountain was messy. My involvement in the mountain was at a time when it was quite messy. And, but I think it's also true, like the Zapatistas say, and Subcomandante Marcos says, right? We make the path by walking, right? Which is that we need to do the work, we need to walk together, we need to figure out the messiness together. And that it's the journey that will allow us to figure out what the path needs to be and how we need to get there. And so in terms of, I think that's the primary lesson around the mountain. I think some of the other lessons that I think need to be things that we take into account is particularly when we're considering, I think the mountain, of course, was done with a lot of love, and I failed to say this at the beginning, but of course, a lot of love and a lot of respect for everyone who was at the mountain in so many different capacities, like Audrey said, folks who were on the mountain for months before, people who were sleeping outside, folks who brought food, so much invisible labor went into lifting up the struggle at the mountain, and a big part of that, I want to give a shout out to Irina. A big part of the structure of the mountain that maybe didn't go noticed or maybe was not desired by some was legal defense. And part of what really supported a lot of Indigenous folks and folks of color not falling through the cracks in the struggle was the fact that there was people who were staffing their legal lines 24 hours a day. Very invisible labor, very background labor, but there was people any hour of the night you could call a legal line, and that was set up in I don't know, how quickly did we set that up? 48 hours. And so a lot of folks stepped up in a lot of different ways to make that possible. So I really want to honor that, you know, there were so many parts of the struggle that were invisible. People who cooked food for the time that I was at, I'm giving up on this mic. You know, for the times that I was at the mountain, I don't think it was a coincidence that most of the people who brought food to the mountain were women and elders, right? Because we know that in our communities, the folks who do the work to feed our communities and nourish our communities are predominantly women and elders, right? That work that is gendered, that is constantly invisible, that's also labor that I think we need to acknowledge and we need to respect, right? So it's in so many different capacities, and also, you know, the incredible wisdom that Ta'a George and Grand Chief Stuart Phillip brought to the mountain on the days that they were there. The wisdom of the mountain rooted, again, not in 1 year, but rooted since time immemorial about what this land means to original caretakers, right? To the original caretakers of the mountain and to these lands. And so I think part of the lesson is, yeah, how do we visibilize all these kinds of labor that happen? What are the kinds of structures that are sometimes needed to make sure that certain voices are lifted up, are honored, are recognized? One of my favorite moments at the mountain, maybe not for others, but that may be me because I'm a person of color, was the fact that on one of the last days at the mountain, we had an Indigenous and people of color only concert at the mountain. And for me, that was an incredible moment because it honored the fact that when we're talking about land defense, when we're talking about struggles to protect land, to protect dignity, to protect people against corporate agendas, against economic deprivation, it is communities of color and Indigenous communities that are the front lines of facing impact and are the front lines of leading those struggles. And so the fact that we were able to do a day, and you know, it wasn't easy to organize that. There was a lot of pushback to having that day at the mountain. But the fact that we could have a day to honor those frontline voices and to say that, you know, all around the world, if we're talking about mining or we're talking about gentrification or we're talking about the tar sands, those are the communities that are at the front line, right? And so sometimes it's about folks coming together, and sometimes it's about people trying to make space to have voices be heard, right? Because that doesn't always come to us naturally. So I think another part of our lessons is if we want to be genuinely inclusive in these beautiful ways, we need to acknowledge some of the differences that rest between us, right? That in an ideal world, we have a shared humanity, but the reality is right now, we don't live in a world where everyone's humanity is equally recognized. And there's nothing that is more evident right now since the context of the Paris attacks, where it is so obvious that certain people are actually cast as outside of humanity. That when things happen to racialized bodies, to Indigenous communities, to poor people, those attacks are never considered an attack on humanity, right? So we also need to do the work to make sure that if we want to build radically inclusive, beautiful spaces, that we need to come together in ways that don't just talk about oneness, in ways that doesn't acknowledge the difference in power and privilege, so that we don't repeat some of those systems. And I know these things are hard to talk about, especially in the context of things that are messy to begin with, and times when we want to honor people. But I think the best ways in which we honor struggle is to honor some of the difficult ways in which we struggle together, right? Because if we want to be respectful of each other, then we need to be respectful of some of the ways in which struggle is hard for some of us, and some of the ways in which struggle doesn't include all of us equally, and some of the ways in which struggle means we have, despite our best intentions, might have overstepped or misstepped, and to learn from those mistakes. Which isn't, again, I'm not saying that any of those happened in very specific ways in Burnaby Mountain, but I think we can see that it happened in very general ways. You want it?
Oh my gosh.
But yeah, that's pretty, I don't know where my time's at. That's mostly what I got. And again, I really deeply want to honor, you know, Caleb was mentioning the words of Melina, and someone that I've been thinking a lot about, and perhaps others have been too, is Ta'a George, and really to lift up the wisdom and the leadership of Ta'a George in the struggle. You know, the wisdom that Ta'a has shared as a residential school survivor, as a land defender, about the importance of the mountain, of the land, of the territory to her communities and her people. And, you know, especially around environmental defense work, one of the things that we sometimes do is that we care so much about the land, but we forget the people who are on the land. right? We separate out environmental rights from human rights as if though those are not intricately connected. And so what would it mean to defend land and defend people of the land, defend people of the inlet, and to stand in alliance and solidarity? But again, you know, in terms of reconciliation in action, part of being in action means to be in alliance. Part of this is doing this work together. And again, I want to continue to remember the words of Marcos, which is that, you know, we make the path by walking, right? So we can only figure it out by being in struggle together, by walking on this journey together, which may take us in different ways at some times, but hopefully we find a way to converge and be in leadership and in alliance with Indigenous nations. Thank you.